Hi, good evening. It's Thinking Slow Group. This is a video we've been trying to put together for a while. It's about the non-COVID deaths in the partially vaccinated. This could be a pointer to what all these short illnesses are that we keep hearing about. What are they? Where are they coming from? And this is focusing in on data that the government doesn't want you looking at and doesn't want you thinking about, and that is the data on the partially vaccinated and on non-COVID deaths. So that's what we're trying to go through today in this short video. So it starts off with another one of these government sound bites that when you actually pick at it means absolutely nothing, and it's a sound bite that then is regurgitated and repeated by our completely supine propaganda pushing mainstream media. So the particular data point here was that of 51,000 COVID deaths, just 256 were breakthrough cases, and then this has been retweeted by the Telegraph so-called science editor, and we actually pulled up the underlying data from that, and here you'll see the 51,281. The 256 doesn't matter so much, but basically this is saying that only 458 of those deaths were fully vaccinated. So the implicit conclusion is that the vaccine is phenomenally effective because hardly anyone died who was fully vaccinated. Now, any person with any sort of critical thinking, i.e. not a mainstream media journalist, would immediately see three quite bizarre things about this. Firstly, this has been run from January, and essentially in January there was really nobody who was fully vaccinated, and the number of fully vaccinated only became sort of meaningful from about March onwards. So why choose this time period? Secondly is the fact that all of this is ignored, and this is what they're going to do over and over again. This is the sort of the partially vaccinated group. This is post first dose, where you see, well, this is now 11,500 deaths, which of course is not mentioned anywhere here. And then of course the real big one for us, which we're going to focus in on now, is this kind of jaw-dropping, for my money, figure here of over 66,000 non-COVID deaths in this little slice, which is the first dose vaccination after 21 days. So this is not a big population in terms of the size of the group, but it's a jaw-dropping number of non-COVID deaths, and that's really what we're going to pick into just now. Hopefully you're going to find this interesting, and we find it completely amazing. And I think this has a lot to do with the short illnesses that we keep reading about. So just putting the sort of how ludicrous those tweets were into a simple chart. This is from a data set that was released with those numbers. These are the total COVID deaths in blue here, and then this is the dotted line of what percentage of the population had the second dose, so therefore were fully vaccinated. And you can see here that because this is a seasonal coronavirus, your deaths are peaking in January, and they sort of mostly go through February, and then by March they're sort of tailing off very significantly. So of course, if you say the first thing that we looked at there was why did they choose that time period? Well, from January to whatever date you choose, just as a matter of basic facts and numbers, many COVID deaths will be unvaccinated, but that only reflects the fact that hardly anyone was vaccinated when this happened. It doesn't reflect whatsoever in any way on the effectiveness of the vaccine, which is what they're trying to suggest. And actually, if you take from here onwards, from sort of early March onwards, these deaths, early March is the point where there were a reasonable number of people doubly vaccinated and partially vaccinated, from here on in, you actually end up with the answer that 2/3 of COVID deaths were partially or fully vaccinated. And that is basically the diametric opposite sort of impression that you're given from the data released by ONS and then repeated by our dishonest propaganda pushing mainstream media. So, this I think alone blows out the main message of what they were trying to do. But in releasing this data, they actually released data on the non-COVID deaths, which I think is really where the action is at, basically. So this is the actual data release, and this is the actual table. And I think most people will be able to understand this table, and even on its own without charts and everything else, I think this really stands out. That this is the number of weeks. This is the partially vaccinated, so this is 21 days or more after the first dose. And what we'll go through a little bit is what this number means, because this is age standardized, which makes it slightly confusing. But as this is non-COVID deaths, and as I was saying, you're getting these very, very large numbers of non-COVID deaths in what is basically a pretty small population. So, if you have 55 million somewhere in England, this group is 2 million, 4 million, but you've got thousands and thousands of deaths in here. So this is actually a very high crude death rate, which you just get by dividing the number of deaths by the size of this group. You end up with a very high crude death rate. And we'll look at that number first before going into what this age standardized number means, but we'll come back to this as well. And all I'll say for now is, these levels of 100 are kind of off the scale. I mean, really, I'm not a expert in mortality statistics, but this is unheard of levels of age standardized mortality, and we'll come back to this table. But the important thing for now is, releasing the underlying data to support their soundbites of 1% of all COVID deaths were fully vaccinated. It wasn't actually an own goal, because this is really where some very strange things are going on, and we think this is the short illness story. So we did actually put that into a chart, and this is the item I was talking about, was the crude death rate for the unvaccinated and for the partially vaccinated. So that's just the number of deaths divided by the group, and it's per 100,000 of that group. So to be fair, early on you would expect the more vulnerable people to have to be vaccinated first. So you probably would expect a high-ish crude death rate in the beginning compared to the unvaccinated. But over time, that should sort of evaporate, because this is for non-COVID causes. But it's not evaporating. There's consistently higher deaths for non-COVID causes amongst the partially vaccinated than there are amongst the unvaccinated. And that's really the question. Why is that, basically? And I think one of the reasons that's been advanced is the fact that this is a different age profile between these two groups, and that's why it's important to look at the age standardized number that we'll have a look at just now. So because I think that really highlights, that will separate out the issue of age, so you'll be basically comparing apples to apples at that point. Now, age standardized mortality can be kind of a bit of a statistical minefield, and I don't want to go off into the statistical weeds here with this one, but just to say that the idea of standardized mortality is that you can compare a sort of crude death rate across two groups with different age profile. And just in a nutshell, basically, if you have a lot of deaths in a very old group, that will translate into a relatively low age standardized mortality rate, because you're bringing you're bringing that group into sort of typical population group. So you actually apply a low weighting to the very heavily concentrated deaths in the older age group. And what it does on the sort of flip side here, which I think is relevant, is if you're having a lot of deaths in the sort of middle of your population distribution, around about 40, when you apply that to a standard population, you'll end up with a quite high weighting applied to those death rates in the sort of 40-year plus minus category. So you'll end up with quite a high age standardized mortality rate. We've actually put a table in the back that will sort of let you think through that intuitively, but I hope you can understand if you have a lot of people dying who are 90 plus, when you try and translate that into an average population, that number will be lowered, essentially, is what we're trying to say, so that then that lower number you can compare against deaths in a more representative population. So a little bit complicated, but it kind of makes sense. It needs a bit of thinking through. But I think it's important to think about that, because that's really the clue to what's going on with these non-COVID deaths and what's going on with that age standardized mortality rate. So this is it, basically. This is directly from ONS. If you want, we can just flick back to make sure this is all straight up, basically. So this is the number that goes into that orange line in that chart, 1-for-1. There's been no adjustments, and there's a similar set of data for the unvaccinated, and I've used that without any adjustments, basically. So this is right from ONS data, and there's that high point of 100 that you could see in the table. Now, I think you have to sort of figure out implicitly what's going on with this, and that's kind of what we've done. And you started off with a high crude rate that's sort of tailed off roughly in the partially vaccinated group, and when you translate that into age standardized, it goes very, very low and then very, very high. So if you sort of implicitly think what might be going on here, this part is effectively those deaths were heavily concentrated in the very elderly, which would make sense because they would be the first people getting vaccinated, and that then pushes quite a high crude rate down into quite a low age standardized rate. But then the real interesting part of this is this section, because here the sort of crude rate was sort of going nowhere in particular, but the age standardized rate's going up through the roof. And we really think now that this is because these deaths are concentrated in the 40-year-old plus minus age group, because that's the only way you could get from a relatively low crude death rate into a very high age standardized mortality rate, is if those deaths were concentrated sort of in the middle of the population, because the way the statistics work, that will give you a very high age standardized mortality rate. And basically we think that's what's going on. And the other thing in this chart is you can now at this stage compare directly the unvaccinated, which is the blue line, with this orange dotted line for the partially vaccinated. So the factor of age has been basically eliminated here, because those rates have been translated into a sort of standardized population distribution. So age is not a factor here. So, again, this is really raising enormous questions about why this would be so much higher than this line, basically. And I think in this part we can explain, because early on the partially vaccinated were very elderly, and therefore they had a very low age standardized mortality rate. But what's going on here is really something that we need to ask a lot of questions about. And we have actually looked at the number of deaths in the sort of this age range, and they are going up, basically, and we can look at that in a second. But this is the crux of the question. Are these the short illnesses that we keep hearing about? Now, the other evidence we've already got is that the ambulance call-out figures in England are significantly higher in summer than they should be. They're well above their long-term average figures. So, again, this is pointing to, what's going on in here, basically. And we can just flick to this chart, which is really zooming in a little bit on the whole items that we're being asked to not look into. So this Professor Whitty person will basically cherry pick sort of weeks of COVID-related deaths here to show, look, this was the rate in the vaccinated and this was the rate in the unvaccinated, and therefore haven't we done a good job? But you can see these blue bars of COVID related deaths are not significant compared to overall mortality in these weeks. This is now total mortality if you add the red and the blue together. And again, this is pointing to relatively massive excess deaths, but mainly coming from non-COVID causes and not from COVID. And that sort of points again to that chart that we saw, the previous one, that the age standardized mortality rate for non-COVID in that partially vaccinated group is very, very high. And that kind of is reflected in this population level data that, these red bars are really causing much more the excess deaths than just the blue bar. So, if this was just COVID, this piece would equal the height of this piece, but you can see even visually, the excess deaths in this piece in this week are much higher than the COVID deaths. So, and the difference will be from non-COVID deaths. So there's clearly elevated non-COVID deaths in the summer of 2021, and this is the short illnesses. They died suddenly. It leaves a lot of questions. What did they die of, and suddenly under what circumstances? And this is really pointing to problems, basically problems that the bureaucrats don't want you asking questions about, because that's why they don't show these charts. They will zoom in on this thing for a couple of weeks here and there, and they don't want people asking too many questions about this. So just before going back to what the government officials actually show you, when you're talking about unvaccinated, it's also interesting, and something they don't do is to look back at 2020, when essentially nobody was vaccinated, and you keep hearing about the phenomenal success of vaccination in 2021. But in all of these charts, that's 2021 is the blue line, and 2020 is the orange dotted line. So whether you're looking at cases, patients on mechanical ventilator beds, or deaths, we're now miles ahead of where we were a year ago. And this does not point to a phenomenal success. This actually raises a lot of questions about how this is possible. And again, it's something that's airbrushed out of any briefing or any discussion of any minister. They just can keep trotting out the same sound bites, and nobody in the press corps will ask, well, if this was so successful, why do we have so many more cases, deaths, and hospitalization than we had a year ago? Nobody asks that question, although it's a very obvious question to ask. And the joke answer of, well, there's different variants, therefore it's all bets are off, just doesn't hold water. So the most important thing about the briefings we're given is not what they actually tell you, it's what they don't tell you. And as I think people hopefully will start to notice, they completely airbrush the partially vaccinated out of all presentations, all charts. So the data is there if you look for it, but it never appears in any of the conclusions. They're just pretending that partially vaccinated doesn't exist, but actually that's where a lot of the problems are. And we can do a separate presentation on this, but for cases, that's really where a lot of questions are showing up. So they ignore the partially vaccinated in order to pursue the narrative, And the other area that they will also never mention are the non-COVID deaths. And I think I've shown in this little video that, you know, there's two questions about that. Why are the non-COVID deaths so much higher in the partially vaccinated? And then also that's reflected at the population level, you know, in the excess death figures that we're seeing in summer 2021. Most of that, or a large part of those excess deaths, are for non-COVID reasons. So what is going on there? Why is that happening? And as we've said, you know, 2021 versus previous year when there was zero vaccination, I wouldn't say it's night and day, but it's significantly higher levels of more or less everything, cases, hospitalization and deaths, than a year ago. So if you want to start comparing vaccinated and unvaccinated, try using the 2020 data when nobody was vaccinated. And again, they deliberately don't do that because they know there's huge questions coming up. You know, how is it possible that this phenomenally successful program has given us more deaths, hospitalizations and cases than we had a year ago? And that's really, you know, what we wanted to say. I mean, for example, this is the last example we wanted to give you. You know, this is the charts they will produce. They'll find a short 2-week period, 32 to 35, where magically they found more deaths in the unvaccinated per 100,000 than in the vaccinated. And you know, this is to a large extent a factor of this population being so much bigger now than that population. There's many more vaccinated than unvaccinated. But if you do something like, you know, any journalist should do but they won't do, is say, well, let's try and look at this same chart a year ago when everybody was unvaccinated, you end up with some pretty interesting questions. Well, how is this possible then, basically? And you know, those are the things you need to be asking. I think many of us now realize that you know, the government and the media are just pushing a narrative, and the narrative doesn't stand up. You pick at it and it falls to pieces. And that was the main point of this video this evening. Hope you found it interesting. So always remember, when you see something, the most important thing is what are you not being told rather than what you are being told. And as we finish with every video, the most important thing is not to stay safe, but to stay free. Because if you're not free, you're not safe. And I think we're beginning to see that more and more every week as we're looking at the news footage coming out of Australia and out of Switzerland. We've been saying this a long time, but it's now becoming abundantly clear how dangerous it is to be operating in these totalitarian regimes. Thank you very much. Goodbye.